On February 25, 2025, in Gaines County, Texas, a school-aged child died of measles. It was the first pediatric death from measles in the United States in more than 20 years. The child was unvaccinated. By April, a second unvaccinated child in the same county had died. By August, when the outbreak was finally declared over, 762 Texans had been infected, the largest measles outbreak in the United States in a generation, centered on a close-knit, deeply religious Mennonite community with chronically low vaccination rates. Measles was declared eliminated from the United States in the year 2000. It came back because we let it. In January 2026, the World Health Organization announced that 6 European countries, including Austria, Spain and the United Kingdom, had lost their measles-free status. Canada has lost its measles elimination status the year before. The United States, as of May 2026, is fighting to keep its own. In the past 50 years, vaccines have saved an estimated 154 million human lives, more than any other medical intervention in history. They have eradicated smallpox from the face of the earth. They have reduced polio by 99.9% globally. They turned measles, once a childhood death sentence, into something a generation grew up never having seen. And a movement built on a single fraudulent paper published by a disgraced physician in 1998, a paper that was retracted, exposed as fabricated, and stripped of its author's medical license, has spent the intervening 27 years dismantling that achievement with extraordinary efficiency. Tonight we trace how it started, what it has cost, and where it ends if we don't change direction. Here's the first thing that surprises most people who assume vaccine hesitancy is a product of the internet age. The anti-vaccine movement is almost exactly as old as vaccines themselves. It did not begin with social media, it began in a church. In 1796, the English physician Edward Jenner made one of the most consequential observations in the history of medicine. He noticed that milkmaids who had been infected with cowpox, a mild, localized disease, seemed to be immune to smallpox, a disease that was killing more than 400,000 people a year across Europe. He tested the idea by taking material from a milkmaid's cowpox sore and injecting it into an 8-year-old boy. The boy proved immune to smallpox. The first vaccine was born. Jenner named the procedure after vaxa, the Latin for cow. The backlash was immediate. In 1722, even before Jenner's discovery, an English reverend named Edmund Massey had delivered a furious sermon entitled "The Dangerous and Sinful Practice of Inoculation," arguing that diseases were divine punishment and any attempt to prevent them was a diabolical operation, amounting to blasphemy. When Jenner's vaccine followed, critics argued it was unnatural. A famous satirical cartoon from 1802 depicted patients being vaccinated and turning into cows, the earliest version of what would become the vaccines permanently alter your body trope, which is still circulating on social media today. By the mid-1800s, the British government had passed a series of vaccination acts, making smallpox vaccination compulsory, first for infants in 1853, then extending to children up to 14 years of age in 1867, with penalties for refusal. The response was not compliance, it was mass protest. The Anti-Vaccination League and the Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League formed. Anti-vaccination journals proliferated, with titles like The Anti-Vaccinator in 1869 and The Vaccination Inquirer in 1879. In 1885, the Leicester Demonstration March drew between 80,000 and 100,000 anti-vaccinators through the streets in what was, by any measure, one of the largest public health protests in history, complete with banners, a child's coffin, and a burning effigy of Edward Jenner. In the United States, the Anti-Vaccination Society of America was founded in 1879. The New England Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League followed in 1882. Court battles were waged across California, Illinois, and Wisconsin. In 1905, the Supreme Court of the United States, in Jacobson versus Massachusetts, ruled for the first time that states could mandate vaccination to protect public health. The anti-vaccine movement had lost that battle. It did not stop fighting. Throughout the 20th century, every new vaccine generated a new controversy. In the 1970s, an international panic erupted over the DTP vaccine, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. A report from Great Ormond Street Hospital in London alleged 36 children had suffered neurological conditions following the immunisation. In 1982, an American documentary called DTP Vaccination Roulette described alleged adverse reactions while minimising the benefits. Vaccination rates dropped. 3 major whooping cough epidemics followed in the United Kingdom. Subsequent research, including a national childhood encephalopathy study launched by the UK's Joint Commission on Vaccination and Immunisation, confirmed the vaccine's safety. The controversy subsided, but a template had been established. A single alarming claim, amplified by media, could drive vaccination rates below the threshold required to prevent disease outbreaks, regardless of whether the claim was true. That template would be perfected in 1998. On February 28, 1998, the prestigious British medical journal The Lancet published a paper by physician Andrew Wakefield and 12 co-authors. The paper described a series of 12 children who had reportedly developed gastrointestinal problems and autism symptoms following vaccination with the MMR vaccine, the combined measles, mumps and rubella vaccine given to children in the first years of their life. The paper's sample size was 12. 12 children in a case series, not a randomized controlled trial, not an epidemiological study, but a peer-reviewed analysis of population-level data. 12 children. The paper did not establish causation. It did not conclude that the MMR vaccine caused autism. But Wakefield held a press conference in which he called for the suspension of the MMR vaccine and recommended that parents request single-dose vaccines instead. Those single-dose vaccines, it would later emerge, he had a financial interest in developing and patenting. The damage was immediate and global. British MMR vaccination rates, which had been at 92% in 1996, fell to 80% by 2003, well below the 95% threshold required to maintain herd immunity against measles. The United States and Australia saw similar declines. Parents across the developed world, having read the headlines, not the paper but the headlines, began refusing the vaccine. It took 12 years for The Lancet to retract the paper. In 2010, the British Medical Journal subsequently published an investigation by journalist Brian Deere that described the research not merely as wrong, but as deliberate fraud. The data had been manipulated, the children's medical histories had been misrepresented, and ethical approval had not been obtained. Wakefield had been paid over £400,000 by a law firm seeking to build a case against vaccine manufacturers before the study was published, a conflict of interest he had concealed. The UK General Medical Council found him guilty of serious professional misconduct and struck him from the medical register. He was no longer a licensed physician. The paper was fraudulent, the data was fabricated, the conclusion was false. More than 20 large-scale epidemiological studies involving millions of children across multiple countries have since found no link between the MMR vaccine and autism. None. The scientific consensus is as complete as it ever gets in medicine. Andrew Wakefield moved to the United States and continued his anti-vaccine advocacy. His 2016 documentary, Vaxxed, was distributed to millions of viewers. He became a figure in the American anti-vaccine movement. As of May 2026, the Secretary of Health and Human Services of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who prior to taking office had publicly stated that there is no vaccine that is safe and effective, has instructed the CDC to reverse its long-standing clinical position that vaccines do not cause autism. A fraud committed in 1998 is now shaping the health policy of the most powerful nation on earth. To understand what is at stake, you have to understand what vaccines actually accomplished, because we've been so protected from these diseases for so long that most people in the developed world have lost all visceral sense of what they used to do. Smallpox killed 1/3 of everyone infected. Of those who survived, 1/3 were left blind. It claimed an estimated 300 million lives in the 20th century alone, more than both world wars combined. Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine, first administered in 1796, began a slow march towards elimination. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated, the only infectious disease in human history to have been completely eliminated through vaccination. It exists now only in 2 research laboratories, one in Atlanta and one in Russia. Not one person on Earth has died of smallpox since 1978. Polio paralyzed tens of thousands of American children annually in the early 1950s. Swimming pools were closed, parents kept children indoors. In 1952 alone, nearly 58,000 cases were reported in the United States. 3,000 died, 21% were left with some degree of paralysis. Jonas Salk's inactivated polio vaccine arrived in 1955. The Sabin oral vaccine followed. By 1979, polio was eliminated from the United States. Globally, polio cases have been reduced by over 99.9% since 1988. Measles killed an estimated 2.6 million children per year globally before the vaccine was introduced. In the United States, before the measles vaccine was licensed in 1963, there were 3 to 4 million cases annually. Of every 1,000 children who got measles, 1 to 2 died. Another 1 in 1,000 developed brain swelling. 1 in 5 unvaccinated children with measles was hospitalized. The 1971 combined MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella in a single shot, was one of the most efficient disease prevention tools ever deployed. By 2000, measles was declared eliminated from the United States. Whooping cough, or pertussis, was killing tens of thousands of infants in the early 20th century. The DTP vaccine, introduced in the 1940s, drove infant whooping cough deaths to near zero in vaccinated nations. Each of these achievements required decades of scientific work, coordinated global effort, and sustained public participation. Each of them is reversible. All of them are currently being reversed at varying speeds in countries where vaccine confidence has fallen below the threshold required to sustain them. In 2025, Australia confirmed its first diphtheria death amid its worst outbreak in decades. The United States reported measles deaths at their highest level in 35 years. The United Kingdom saw its first whooping cough infant death of the year from a mother who was unvaccinated during pregnancy. Diseases that entire generations never saw are coming back, not because the science failed, because the trust did. Statistics are abstractions, deaths are not. Here are 3 real people, 2 children and an infant, whose stories are the direct documented consequence of the anti-vaccination movement's success. Case 1. The first child, Gaines County, Texas, February 2025. On February 25, 2025, a school-aged child in Gaines County, Texas died of measles. The child was unvaccinated and had no known underlying health conditions. This was the first pediatric death from measles in the United States in more than 22 years. The last had been in 2003. The outbreak had begun in the close-knit Mennonite community of Seminole in Gaines County, where vaccination rates had been chronically low for years. Mennonite communities, like several other tight-knit religious communities across the United States, had developed strong cultural skepticism of vaccination, a skepticism that had been fed for decades by the same misinformation networks that the broader anti-vaccine movement had spent years constructing. Measles is so contagious that if an infected person walks into a room and then leaves, the virus lingers in the air for up to 2 hours, long enough to infect any unvaccinated person who subsequently enters that room without any contact with the original carrier. Of unvaccinated people exposed to measles, 9 out of 10 will become infected. One person with measles will infect 12 to 18 others who are unvaccinated. In a community with low vaccination rates, measles does not spread, it detonates. Case 2. The second child, Gaines County, Texas, April 2025. On April 7, 2025, the Texas Department of State Health Services confirmed a second child had died of measles in the same outbreak, also unvaccinated, also in Gaines County, also from the same Mennonite community. By the time the outbreak was declared over in August 2025, 762 Texans had been infected. Cases had spread to neighboring New Mexico, where a suspected measles-related adult death was reported in March. Colorado reported 16 additional cases. In total, the United States recorded measles cases at their highest level in 33 years. The country's measles elimination status, achieved in 2000, is now at risk. The CDC's own criteria state that elimination status is lost if linked cases continue for more than 12 months. 2 children died of a disease that had been a safe, 97% effective, widely available vaccine since 1971. They died in 2025 in the United States of America. Case 3, the infant, United Kingdom 2025. In August 2025, the UK Health Security Agency announced that a baby had died of whooping cough, pertussis, between January and June of that year. It was the first fatal case of whooping cough in the United Kingdom in 2025. The cause, in the UK HSA's own language, was direct. The baby's mother had not been vaccinated against whooping cough during pregnancy. This detail requires explanation. Infants cannot receive their first whooping cough vaccination until 8 weeks of age. In the critical weeks before that first dose, their only protection comes from maternal antibodies, passed through the placenta from a mother who was vaccinated during pregnancy. The UK has offered pregnant women a whooping cough vaccine since 2012 specifically for this reason. When a mother declines it, her newborn arrives in the world with no protection against a bacterial infection that can be fatal in infants within days. The UK HSA documented that of the 33 infants who had died of whooping cough in the UK since 2013, 27 had mothers who had not received the pregnancy vaccine. That is not a correlation. That is a near-perfect documented relationship between a preventable maternal decision and an infant's death. 11 infants died of whooping cough in the UK in 2024 alone. The uptake rate among pregnant women for the whooping cough vaccine as of 2025 stood at 72.6%, far below the recommended threshold. 3 cases, 3 deaths, all of them preventable, all of them predicted, all of them documented. We've traced the movement from Jenner's first vaccine through Wakefield's fraud and into the children's funerals. Now we get to the mechanism that makes all of this so consequential at scale. The concept that explains why your vaccination decision is never purely personal. And then we look at the countries where anti-vaccination movements have taken hold with the most devastating effects. The concept of herd immunity is the most important and least understood idea of the entire vaccination debate, because the anti-vaccine movement has consistently framed vaccination as a purely personal medical decision, your body, your choice, in a way that is simultaneously sincere and epidemiologically catastrophic. Here's why. Herd immunity, also called community immunity, is the protection that a population gains when enough of its members are immune to a disease that the disease can no longer spread efficiently. When the proportion of immune individuals exceeds a disease-specific threshold, an infected person cannot find enough susceptible hosts to sustain a chain of transmission. The case doesn't just spread more slowly, it burns itself out. The threshold varies by how contagious the disease is, technically measured by the basic reproduction number, or 0, the average number of people one infected person will infect in a fully susceptible population. Measles has an R0 of 12 to 18, the highest of any infectious disease we commonly vaccinate against. One measles patient infects 12 to 18 others in an unvaccinated population. To break that chain, approximately 93 to 95% of the population must be immune. The World Health Organization recommends 95% MMR coverage. The UK's 5-year MMR rate in 2024 was 83.7, its lowest since 2009. The United States is losing ground in multiple states. Whooping cough has a herd immunity threshold of approximately 92 to 94%. Polio requires approximately 80 to 85% for herd immunity. Here's why these numbers matter for people who are not personally refusing vaccines. There is a population of people who cannot be vaccinated, not by choice, but by biology. Newborns under 6 weeks of age, children with certain immunodeficiencies, cancer patients on chemotherapy whose immune systems cannot mount a response to a vaccine, pregnant women for certain vaccines, elderly people whose immune systems have weakened with age, people with severe allergies to vaccine components. These people are not making an anti-vaccine choice. They are medically unable to protect themselves. Their only protection is the immunity of the people around them. When vaccination rates fall below the herd immunity threshold, the firebreak fails, and the virus finds the immunocompromised child, the unprotected newborn, the cancer patient in the oncology ward. This is why the framing of vaccination as a purely individual decision is not just philosophically wrong, it is factually wrong. When a parent in Gaines County, Texas, chose not to vaccinate their child based on misinformation, that decision did not stay within their family. It contributed to an environment in which the measles virus found enough susceptible hosts to sustain 762 infections and 2 deaths. Your vaccination status is a public health act. It always has been. The anti-vaccines movement success in reframing it as a private liberty issue is, arguably, its single most damaging intellectual achievement. Anti-vaccine sentiment is not an American phenomenon. It is a global one, and its geography tells a specific story about the relationship between political polarization, social media penetration, and the erosion of institutional trust. The United States. The United States is one of the most politically divided vaccine landscapes in the democratic world. A Pew Research study cited in the Council on Foreign Relations analysis from April 2026 found that Republicans are significantly less likely to express high confidence in childhood vaccines than Democrats, 48% versus 80%. A 32 percentage point partisan gap on a basic public health question. That gap has now reached federal policy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's prior to becoming HHS Secretary, publicly stated that there is no vaccine that is safe and effective, has instructed the CDC to reverse its position on the vaccine autism question that Andrew Wakefield manufactured in 1998 and Brian Deere dismantled in 2011. As CFR's Thomas Balicki put it plainly, the vaccine misinformation that could only be found online is now creeping into official US policy sources and vaccine recommendations, and it will begin to reverberate globally too. The US is simultaneously experiencing its worst measles outbreak in 33 years and defunding the CDC's chronic disease prevention infrastructure. At the same time, France and Western Europe. France has historically been one of the most vaccine-hesitant nations in the developed world, a country where skepticism of pharmaceutical companies and institutional medicine run deep in the cultural mainstream, not just at the fringes. The Vaccine Confidence Project at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has tracked France as a consistent outlier in vaccine confidence surveys for over a decade. The broader European picture, as documented by the CFR analysis, is alarming. Since 2015, trust in vaccine safety has declined in most European countries surveyed, with the steepest drops around 20% points in Germany and Sweden. Romania's DTP3 vaccination coverage fell from 89% in 2015 to 79% by 2024, well below the threshold of 90%. Austria saw a 15 percentage point drop in vaccine confidence between 2015 and 2023, with coverage falling from 93% to 85%. In January 2026, the World Health Organization announced that 6 European countries had lost their measles-free status, including Austria, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Bulgaria, Hungary, and Latvia, among the countries with the highest level of vaccine skepticism in Europe, rely on mandatory vaccination laws just to sustain coverage rates above 90%. Without those mandates, the rates would likely collapse. The COVID-19 pandemic, paradoxically, deepened vaccine hesitancy in many European nations. Initial urgency drove uptake, and then debates over mandates, boosters, and the rapid development timelines spread into broader skepticism of the entire childhood vaccine schedule. The anti-vaccine movement used COVID to relitigate MMR, HPV, and flu vaccines in communities that had been broadly compliant for decades. Pakistan, the last battlefield for polio. Pakistan is one of only 2 countries in the world, the other is Afghanistan, where polio has never been eradicated. The reason is not scientific. The polio vaccine works. The oral vaccine is cheap, easy to administer, and extraordinarily effective. The reason is violence and organized disinformation. For decades, Pakistani health workers administering polio vaccine in certain regions have been targeted by Taliban-affiliated groups who spread the claim, actively and deliberately, that the polio vaccine is a Western sterilization program. The disinformation has proven extraordinarily durable, despite being completely fabricated. Vaccinators have been killed, vaccination campaigns have had to be suspended in active conflict zones. The pool of unvaccinated children that sustains transmission has persisted for 3 decades. Since the establishment of Pakistan's National Polio Eradication Program in 1994, Cases have been reduced by 99.6%, from tens of thousands annually to single digits in recent years. The eradication is within reach. But as long as pockets of unvaccinated children exist, the virus persists, mutates, and retains the capacity to re-export to countries that thought they were protected. Pakistan is not merely an internal problem. In a world where people travel by plane, every unvaccinated Pakistani child is a potential vector for global polio re-emergence. The broader global picture. The World Health Organization's April 2025 report put the global situation in the starkest possible terms. Vaccine-preventable diseases are rising globally, risking the re-emergence of diseases that had virtually disappeared. Canada lost its measles elimination status in 2024, the year before 6 European nations followed. A measles outbreak in Mexico began in largely unvaccinated Mennonite communities, mirroring precisely what happened in Gaines County, Texas. The same community, the same disinformation, the same predictable outcome in a different country. Australia confirmed its first diphtheria death in May 2026, amid its worst diphtheria outbreak in decades. Diphtheria, a disease that the DTP vaccine has held at near zero for half a century. And underlying all of it, the United States withdrawal from the World Health Organization and the termination of the US aid funding for vaccination programs in lower income countries. It has weakened immunization systems across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, precisely as vaccine-preventable diseases are re-emerging globally. The countries that were closest to eradicating the diseases, the Ghanas, the Indias, the Nepals, which went from under 10% childhood vaccination in 1980 to over 90% today, are now seeing that progress threatened by funding cuts from the country that had been its biggest backer. Anti-vaccine movements do not sustain themselves on science, they sustain themselves on narrative, and the most powerful amplifiers of the anti-vaccine narrative in the 21st century have not been obscure pamphlets or fringe websites. They have been famous faces, television cameras, and an algorithmic recommendation engines. Jenny McCarthy went on the Oprah Winfrey Show in 2007 and told an audience of millions that her son's autism had been caused by his MMR vaccine, and that she had cured him through diet and supplements. McCarthy had no medical training. The medical consensus on the vaccine autism question was already, by 2007, overwhelmingly in the other direction. It didn't matter. She had Oprah's platform. Her subsequent book became a bestseller. Wow, go figure. She was given a column at the Chicago Sun-Times. She became the most effective single communicator of Andrew Wakefield's fraudulent thesis to American mothers. Robert De Niro, whose son has autism, attempted in 2016 to include the anti-vaccine film Vaxxed, produced by Andrew Wakefield himself, in the Tribeca Film Festival, which he co-founded. The film was ultimately withdrawn after protests from the scientific community, but De Niro's public defense of it, "I think the movie is something that people should see," was covered globally. Jim Carrey became a vocal anti-vaccine activist in the late 2000s, initially in a relationship with Jenny McCarthy and then independently tweeting graphic anti-vaccine content to millions of followers. Ethan Lindenberger, in contrast, became one of the movement's most powerful inadvertent opponents. An Ohio teenager raised by an anti-vaccine mother who believed vaccines caused autism and brain damage, Lindenberger reached adulthood having never received a standard childhood vaccine. On his 18th birthday, he got vaccinated. In March 2019, he testified before the United States Senate about growing up unvaccinated, about the fear, the isolation, the feeling of being placed at risk by misinformation that his mother had absorbed from online communities. He told the Senate, "Anti-vaccination information online is dangerous." His testimony was watched by millions. His mother's belief had not changed. The algorithm dimension of this story is not incidental. As Heidi Larson, director of the Vaccine Confidence Project, noted, the scale of virtual connectedness nowadays is unprecedented, and this emboldens skepticism about vaccines because people surround themselves with others who believe the same thing. Recommendation algorithms on YouTube, Facebook, and later TikTok consistently pushed users who expressed any vaccine skepticism deeper into anti-vaccine content, because skepticism generates engagement and engagement generates revenue. The radicalization pipeline from "my child had a fever after a shot" to "vaccines are a government sterilization program" was not an accident. It was for years a product feature. Here's the honest accounting. In the past 50 years, vaccines saved 154 million lives. They eradicated the only disease in human history ever to be fully eliminated. They reduced polio by 99.9%. They turned measles into something an entire generation in the developed world grew up never having seen, and then, within a single generation after that, they allowed it to come back. The mechanism of the reversal is documented with extraordinary precision. A fraudulent paper, published in 1998, retracted in 2010, exposed as fabricated data by 2011, with no replication in over 20 large-scale studies involving millions of children. That paper generated a doubt that proved impossible to fully extinguish once it had been planted, because the doubt served too many interests: celebrity interests, political interests, commercial interests, algorithmic interests. The vaccine autism claim is fake. It has always been fake. The man who fabricated it lost his medical license. He's still making films. He's still appearing at rallies. His thesis now informs US federal health policy. The children in Gaines County, Texas are dead. They were not the last. The World Health Organization has documented rising vaccine-preventable disease outbreaks across every region in the world. 6 European countries lost their measles-free status in 2026. Australia is treating diphtheria again. Pakistan's polio eradication, within reach after 3 decades of effort, is being disrupted by the same global funding cuts that are unraveling immunization systems across the developing world. The herd immunity thresholds are not negotiable. They are not political positions. Measles requires 95% of vaccination coverage to stay suppressed. When coverage falls to 83%, it comes back. It kills the children who were unvaccinated. It sickens the immunocompromised people who couldn't be vaccinated. It infects the newborns who were too young. The virus does not read philosophical arguments about personal liberty. It reads susceptible hosts. Every person who chooses not to vaccinate, based on information they absorbed from a disgraced physician's fabricated data, amplified by a celebrity interview, amplified by a recommendations algorithm, is making a decision that is not only about themselves. They are making a decision about the unvaccinated infant next door, about the child with leukemia in the school down the street, about the 93% coverage threshold that, if everyone made the same choice, would break down completely. The choice is theirs, the consequences are documented, the deaths have names. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. The anti-vaccination movement did not begin on the internet. It began the moment Edward Jenner invented vaccination in 1796. Human beings have been finding reasons to refuse protection from infectious disease for as long as protection from infectious disease has been available. The reasons have changed, from religious objection to personal liberty to autism fears to government conspiracy, but the emotional architecture has been the same for 230 years. Distrust of institutions, fear of the unnatural, and the deeply human conviction that the risk of acting is more visible than the risk of not acting. The risk of the vaccine is visible. You can see the needle. You can feel the injection site. If your child develops a fever afterwards, you remember it. The risk of the disease the vaccine prevents is invisible because the vaccine prevented it. You cannot see the measles your child didn't get. You cannot count the whooping cough deaths that didn't happen. You cannot mourn the polio that was stopped before it paralyzed the leg. Andrew Wakefield exploited the asymmetry with a fabricated data set in a press conference. He made the invisible danger of the disease disappear and the imaginary danger of the vaccine vivid and personal and terrifying. And then the internet took his work and ran with it, and the algorithms monetized it, and the celebrities amplified it, and the politicians normalized it. And 2 children died in Texas in 2025 of a disease that has been preventable since 1963. The herd does not protect itself by individual decision. It protects itself by collective decision, by enough people choosing freely and with full information to be part of the firebreak that the virus cannot cross. When enough people opt out of that firebreak, the firebreak fails. Not for them necessarily, for the people who had no choice. Drop a comment. I want to know where you stand. Were you vaccinated? Did you vaccinate your children? Has this video changed anything about how you think about the question? The comment section on this one matters. Subscribe for the next video in the series. We're going into the psychology of why ordinary people follow orders to commit atrocities. That one will change how you look at every story in this series. I'll see you there.